You know, Hollywood has always been great at selling us fairy tales. We see our favorite stars on screen, laughing together, sharing intimate moments, creating magic that keeps us glued to our seats for decades. But what if I told you that behind one of television's most beloved westerns, there was a feud so intense, so personal, that it nearly tore apart the very fabric of what made the show special? What if the man who became synonymous with integrity and honor on screen harbored feelings so dark toward one of his co-stars that he could barely stand to be in the same room with them? James Arness, the towering figure who brought Marshal Matt Dillon to life for 20 years on Gunsmoke, was known for his professionalism, his kindness, and his dedication to his craft. But there was one person who managed to get under his skin in a way that nobody else could. And today, after all these years, we're finally going to uncover the truth about who that person was and why their relationship became so toxic that it affected everyone around them. Before we dive into this explosive revelation, let me take you back to a time when television westerns ruled the airwaves. It was 1955, and America was hungry for heroes. World War II was still fresh in the collective memory, and people wanted to believe in justice, in right versus wrong, in men who stood tall against the chaos of the world. Enter Gunsmoke, a show that would redefine what television could be. But this wasn't just any western. This was a show that dealt with real human drama, moral complexity, and characters that felt like they could walk off your screen and into your living room. At the center of it all was James Arness, a man who had been personally recommended for the role by his good friend John Wayne. Now, Wayne and Arness had a relationship that went beyond mere friendship. Wayne saw something in Arness that reminded him of himself, that same rugged determination, that same commitment to authenticity. When CBS came calling, looking for their Marshal Dillon, Wayne told them there was only one man for the job. He even introduced the very first episode of Gunsmoke, telling audiences that they were about to meet someone special. And he wasn't wrong. James Arness brought a gravitas to the role that nobody else could have matched. Standing at 6 feet 7 inches, he was an imposing physical presence, but it was his subtle acting, his ability to convey depth with just a look, that made Matt Dillon more than just another gunslinging lawman. He was a man burdened by the weight of his responsibilities, a man who understood that justice wasn't always black and white. For 20 years, Arness would inhabit this character, becoming so identified with Marshal Dillon that it's almost impossible to imagine anyone else in the role. But here's where things get interesting. A show doesn't run for 2 decades without incredible chemistry among its cast members, and Gunsmoke had that in spades, at least most of the time. There was Milburn Stone as Doc Adams, the cantankerous but lovable physician who served as Matt's confidant and conscience. There was Amanda Blake as Miss Kitty Russell, the tough-as-nails saloon owner whose relationship with Matt was one of television's most enduring will-they-won't-they storylines. And then there was Dennis Weaver as Chester Good, Matt's loyal but somewhat bumbling deputy who provided much of the show's comic relief in those early years. These 4 actors became the heart of Gunsmoke, and for the most part, they got along famously. Arness was known to be protective of his cast mates, often fighting with producers to ensure they got the recognition and compensation they deserved. He understood that the show's success wasn't just about him, it was about the ensemble, about how these characters played off each other and created something magical. But then something changed. As the show evolved and new characters were introduced, the dynamics began to shift. One of the most significant additions to the cast was Ken Curtis as Festus Hagen, who joined the show after Dennis Weaver left to pursue other opportunities. Now, Curtis was no stranger to Hollywood. He had been a singer with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, he had appeared in numerous films, and he actually had a personal connection to the show's universe. He was married to Barbara Ford, the daughter of legendary director John Ford, and he had worked with both Ford and John Wayne on multiple occasions. In fact, Curtis had appeared in several John Wayne films, including The Searchers, one of the greatest westerns ever made. So when he joined Gunsmoke, everyone assumed it would be a seamless transition. But here's where our story takes a dark turn. You see, despite all these connections, despite the fact that Curtis seemed like the perfect fit for the show, something went terribly wrong between him and James Arness. The tension started almost immediately, though it was subtle at first. Those who worked on the set began to notice little things. Arness would avoid Curtis between takes. Their scenes together, while professional on camera, lacked the warmth and spontaneity that characterized Arness's interactions with other cast members. There were whispered conversations in corners, meaningful glances exchanged among crew members who had been with the show long enough to remember how things used to be. But what exactly was the problem? What could have caused such a rift between two men who should have been natural allies? To understand that, we need to dig deeper into who these men really were, beyond the characters they played on screen. James Arness was, by all accounts, a man of few words off-screen, much like the character he portrayed. He had served with distinction in World War II, landing at Anzio where he was severely wounded in his right leg, an injury that would pain him for the rest of his life. That experience had shaped him, given him a perspective on life that valued authenticity and substance over flash and showmanship. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and he had very clear ideas about how things should be done. Arness was methodical in his approach to acting, always prepared, always professional, and he expected the same from those around him. He wasn't interested in the Hollywood party scene, wasn't looking to be a celebrity beyond what his job required. He wanted to do good work, tell good stories, and then go home to his family. This made him respected, even beloved, by most of his colleagues. But it also meant that when someone rubbed him the wrong way, when someone violated his sense of how things should be, he didn't forget it. Ken Curtis, on the other hand, was a very different personality. He was outgoing, gregarious, always ready with a story or a joke. His background in music had given him a performer's sensibility. He loved being in front of an audience, loved the attention and the applause. When he took on the role of Festus Hagen, he threw himself into it completely, developing an elaborate backstory for the character, working on the accent and mannerisms until Festus felt like a real person. And audiences loved him for it. Festus became a fan favorite, with his folksy wisdom and his unwavering loyalty to Matt Dillon. But here's the thing that not everyone knows. Curtis didn't just want to play Festus, he wanted to shape the character, to have creative input into how the show developed. He had ideas, lots of them, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. He would suggest changes to scripts, propose new storylines, even offer notes on how scenes should be played. Now, in some environments, this kind of enthusiasm might be welcomed. After all, who knows a character better than the actor who inhabits them? But on the Gunsmoke set, where James Arness had been the undisputed leader for over a decade, where the rhythms and protocols had long been established, Curtis's approach was seen as something else entirely. It was seen as presumptuous. The first real conflict came during the preparation for an episode in Curtis's second season on the show. Curtis had come to the producers with an idea for a Festus-centered storyline, something that would really showcase the character and explore his background. The producers, always looking for fresh material after so many years on the air, were interested. They took the idea to the writers, and a script was developed. But when Arness got wind of it, he was not pleased. You have to understand, Gunsmoke had always been structured around Marshal Matt Dillon. He was the anchor, the center around which everything else revolved. Other characters had their moments, certainly. There were episodes that focused on Doc or Kitty or Chester in the early years. But they were always in service of the larger story, always connected back to Matt in some meaningful way. Arness had fought hard to maintain that structure, believing it was essential to the show's identity. So when he heard about this Festus-centric episode that would push Matt to the background, he saw it as a fundamental misunderstanding of what Gunsmoke was supposed to be. He went to the producers and made his feelings known. The conversation was heated, with Arness arguing that they were losing sight of what had made the show successful in the first place. The producers tried to explain that after so many years, they needed to find ways to keep things fresh, to give audiences new perspectives. But Arness was unmoved. He felt that Curtis was trying to take over the show, to make it about Festus rather than Matt Dillon. And perhaps most importantly, he felt that Curtis should have come to him first, should have discussed the idea with him before going to the producers. That, in Arness's view, was a violation of the chain of command, a sign of disrespect. The episode was eventually produced, though with significant changes that brought Matt more prominently into the story. But the damage was done. From that point forward, Arness viewed Curtis with suspicion, seeing him not as a collaborator but as a threat. But wait, there's more to this story, because the professional tensions were only part of the picture. There were also personal factors at play, things that had nothing to do with scripts or screen time but everything to do with who these men were as people. One of the things that grated on Arness was Curtis's approach to publicity and fan interaction. Curtis loved meeting fans, loved signing autographs and doing interviews. He would stay after filming to talk with visitors to the set, would agree to almost any promotional appearance the network asked for. On the surface, this seems admirable, right? Here was a man who understood that the fans were the reason they all had jobs, who was willing to give back to the people who supported the show. But Arness saw it differently. He felt that Curtis was too eager for the spotlight, that he was more interested in being famous than in doing good work. Arness had always maintained a boundary between his public persona and his private life. He did the publicity that was required of him, but he didn't seek it out, didn't chase after it. He believed that the work should speak for itself. There were also rumors, never confirmed but persistent nonetheless, that Curtis would sometimes take credit for ideas or improvisations that had actually come from other people. In the collaborative environment of a television show, it's not always clear who originated what. A writer might sketch out a scene, a director might suggest a different approach, an actor might add a line or a gesture that makes it all come together. Most of the time, everyone understands that it's a team effort and nobody worries too much about who gets credit for what. But according to some sources, Curtis had a habit of talking in interviews about how he had developed certain aspects of Festus, how he had come up with particular bits of business, without always acknowledging the contributions of others. Whether this was intentional or just the natural tendency of an enthusiastic performer to remember his own contributions more clearly than those of others, it rubbed people the wrong way. And in a close-knit company like the Gunsmoke cast and crew, word got around. Things came to a head during the filming of a particularly challenging episode in the show's 17th season. It was a story that required close collaboration between Matt and Festus, with several long scenes of dialogue between them. The script called for a level of emotional intimacy between the characters, a sense of deep friendship and mutual respect. But by this point, the real-life relationship between Arness and Curtis had deteriorated to such an extent that it was affecting their ability to work together. During rehearsals, there was a palpable tension. Arness would deliver his lines with professional precision but without warmth. Curtis, feeling the coldness, would overcompensate, trying to inject energy and emotion into his performance. The director could see that something was off, but he was in a difficult position. How do you tell two experienced professionals that their personal issues are showing up on camera? How do you mediate a conflict between the star of the show and a key supporting player without making things worse? The situation finally exploded during the actual filming of a pivotal scene. They had been doing take after take, with the director never quite satisfied with what he was seeing. Curtis, frustrated, finally spoke up. He suggested that maybe if Arness gave him a little more to work with, if there was more genuine emotion in Matt's responses, the scene would come together. It was, on its face, a reasonable observation. Good acting is a two-way street, after all. But to Arness, it was the final straw. Here was Curtis, who had been with the show for just a few years, presuming to tell him, the man who had been Matt Dillon for nearly 2 decades, how to play his character. Arness didn't shout, didn't make a scene. That wasn't his style. Instead, he very calmly called for a break, walked off the set, and went to his dressing room. Filming was suspended for the rest of the day. The producers were called in for an emergency meeting. And while the details of that meeting have never been fully disclosed, those who were present say that Arness made it clear that he couldn't continue working under these conditions. Now, you might be thinking that surely cooler heads prevailed, that some kind of reconciliation was reached. After all, the show did continue for several more years with both Arness and Curtis in the cast. And you'd be right that they found a way to make it work, at least professionally. But it wasn't through any grand gesture of forgiveness or understanding. Instead, what emerged was a carefully managed system of avoidance. Scripts were structured to minimize direct interaction between Matt and Festus. When scenes together were unavoidable, they were kept short and focused on action rather than dialogue. The filming schedule was arranged so that Arness and Curtis spent as little time as possible on set at the same time. It was, in essence, a Cold War, managed through professional protocols and maintained by sheer force of will on both sides. And perhaps most tellingly, After Gunsmoke finally ended in 1975, after 20 years and 635 episodes, after becoming the longest-running primetime live-action series with continuing characters in American television history, Arness and Curtis never worked together again. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because the narrative I've been building, the one you probably expected, isn't actually the complete truth. Yes, there were tensions between Ken Curtis and James Arness. Yes, there were creative disagreements and personality clashes. But Curtis wasn't the co-star that James Arness utterly hated. The real answer is more complicated, more nuanced, and in some ways more tragic than a simple tale of two actors who couldn't get along. Because the person who caused Arness the most difficulty, the one whose presence on the show created the most stress and conflict, wasn't Ken Curtis at all. It was, surprisingly, Dennis Weaver, the man who played Chester Good during the show's first 9 seasons. And the reason why might shock you, because it had nothing to do with personal animosity or professional jealousy. It had everything to do with ambition, loyalty, and what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. Dennis Weaver joined Gunsmoke at the very beginning, part of the core group that established the show's identity. His portrayal of Chester, with that distinctive stiff-legged walk and his characteristic Mr. Dillon greeting, made him instantly recognizable and beloved by audiences. Weaver was a talented actor, no question about that. He brought humor and heart to the role, creating a character who was loyal, brave in his own way, and endearingly imperfect. The relationship between Matt and Chester was one of the show's foundations, a partnership built on mutual respect despite the obvious differences in their capabilities and stations. But here's what was happening behind the scenes. Almost from the beginning, Weaver was ambivalent about being on Gunsmoke. He saw it as a stepping stone, a place to get exposure and build his career before moving on to bigger things. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, of course. Actors are allowed to have ambitions, to want to challenge themselves with different roles and expand their range. But the way Weaver went about pursuing those ambitions, and the impact it had on the show and his relationship with Arness, created a situation that was far more damaging than anything that happened with Ken Curtis. From very early on, Weaver was looking for ways out of his contract. He would miss filming to audition for movies, would negotiate for time off to do other projects, was constantly talking to his agent about what came next instead of focusing on what was in front of him. Arness, who had committed himself fully to Gunsmoke, who had turned down film opportunities because he believed in the show and what they were building, found this attitude baffling and, ultimately, infuriating. To him, Weaver's behavior was a betrayal of the ensemble, a message that Gunsmoke wasn't good enough, that the work they were doing together didn't matter as much as personal ambition. It got to the point where Arness could barely hide his frustration. When Weaver would show up unprepared for a scene because he'd been up late working on a film audition, Arness would give him a look that could freeze fire. When Weaver would complain about the limitations of playing Chester, about how the character wasn't giving him enough opportunities to showcase his range, Arness would remind him, sometimes not very gently, that nobody was forcing him to be there. The really poisonous part of the situation was that Weaver's dissatisfaction was affecting everyone. It's hard to build chemistry and maintain the kind of ensemble spirit that makes a show great when one of the key players is constantly looking for the exit. Milburn Stone and Amanda Blake, who were committed to Gunsmoke for the long haul, found themselves having to compensate for Weaver's distraction, to work harder to maintain the show's quality when he was phoning it in. And Arness, as the leader of the cast and the face of the show, felt responsible for holding everything together. It wore on him, this constant tension, this feeling that he was trying to build something lasting while one of his key collaborators was treating it as a temporary gig. When Weaver finally left the show in 1964 to pursue other opportunities, Arness didn't fight to keep him. In fact, according to some sources, he was relieved to see him go. The official story was that Weaver wanted to move on to other challenges, and that was certainly true. But the full truth was that the relationship had deteriorated to the point where having him around was more trouble than it was worth. Now, you might be wondering why this story hasn't been told more widely. Why, if Arness had such difficulties with Weaver, has it remained relatively obscure compared to other Hollywood feuds? The answer has to do with Arness's character and his approach to his career. He wasn't interested in airing dirty laundry, wasn't interested in using the press to settle scores or make himself look good at someone else's expense. He believed that what happened on set should stay on set, that professionals handled their disagreements privately and then moved on. Even in later years, when he was asked about his time on Gunsmoke and his relationships with his co-stars, Arness was consistently gracious and diplomatic. He would praise Weaver's talent, acknowledge his contributions to the show's success, and avoid any suggestion of conflict. It was only through careful reading of interviews, through conversations with people who were there at the time, through the occasional unguarded moment, that the real story emerged. There's also the fact that Weaver himself seemed to have mixed feelings about his time on Gunsmoke. In some interviews, he would speak fondly of those early years, of the camaraderie and the learning experiences. But in others, you could hear the frustration, the sense that he had been trapped in a role that limited him, that those 9 years could have been spent building a more varied and prestigious career. After leaving Gunsmoke, Weaver did find success in other venues, most notably as the star of McCloud, a detective series that ran from 1970 to 1977. He also appeared in numerous films and won an Emmy Award for his work. So in some sense, his ambition was justified. He was capable of more than just playing Chester Good. But here's the question that haunted the relationship between Arness and Weaver for years afterward. At what cost? What did Weaver's single-minded pursuit of his own career goals cost the show, cost his relationships with his co-stars, cost his own peace of mind during those years when he was constantly struggling against where he was instead of embracing it? Now let's talk about Amanda Blake for a moment, because her relationship with Arness provides an interesting contrast. Blake played Miss Kitty Russell for 19 of the show's 20 seasons, leaving just 1 year before the series finale. Like Weaver, she had opportunities to leave earlier, had offers to do other projects. But unlike Weaver, she approached these decisions differently. When she did leave Gunsmoke, it was with Arness's blessing and with the understanding that she had given the show everything she had for nearly 2 decades. There was no bitterness, no sense of betrayal. They remained friends long after the show ended, speaking warmly of each other in interviews and maintaining a connection that testified to the depth of what they had built together. The difference wasn't talent. Both Weaver and Blake were immensely talented. The difference was attitude, was the willingness to be fully present and committed while they were part of the Gunsmoke family, rather than always looking over the fence at what else might be out there. And what about John Wayne in all of this? Remember, Wayne was the one who had recommended Arness for the role in the first place, who had essentially launched his television career. Wayne and Arness remained close friends throughout the Western star's life, and Wayne followed Gunsmoke's progress with interest. There are stories, perhaps apocryphal but repeated often enough to suggest some truth, that Wayne would occasionally weigh in on cast dynamics, offering Arness advice on how to handle difficult situations. Wayne, who had navigated the complexities of Hollywood for decades and had worked with virtually every type of personality imaginable, understood the challenges of maintaining an ensemble over a long run. He counseled patience but also firmness, the idea that a leader has to be willing to make hard decisions to protect the integrity of the project. Whether Wayne's advice specifically addressed the situation with Weaver isn't known, but it's clear that Arness valued his friend's perspective and that those conversations helped him navigate some of the more difficult moments of his television career. The irony of the whole situation with Dennis Weaver is that Chester Good became one of the most beloved characters in television history. People who watched Gunsmoke during those first 9 seasons have vivid memories of Chester, of his loyalty and his humor and his relationship with Matt Dillon. In many ways, Chester was as important to the show's early success as any of the main characters. But Weaver himself never seemed to fully appreciate what he had, never seemed to recognize that being part of something that brought joy and meaning to millions of people was itself an achievement worth celebrating. Instead, he was always chasing the next thing, the bigger opportunity, the role that would finally prove he was more than just a sidekick. And in the process, he damaged relationships, created stress and conflict, and ultimately left behind a legacy that is more complicated than it needed to be. After Weaver left, the show went on to even greater success, proving that while Chester had been important, he wasn't irreplaceable. Ken Curtis's Festus brought a different energy to the deputy role, and while there were adjustments to be made, the core of what made Gunsmoke special remained intact. Arness was still the center, the anchor, the moral compass around which everything else revolved. And without the constant tension of dealing with Weaver's ambivalence and dissatisfaction, the set became a more relaxed and enjoyable place to work. The later seasons of Gunsmoke are often overlooked in favor of the early black and white episodes, but they contained some truly excellent television, stories that were more complex and nuanced than what had been possible in the early days. And much of that evolution was made possible by having a cast and crew that were fully committed to the show, that weren't distracted by other ambitions or agendas. This brings us to a larger question about loyalty and ambition in Hollywood, about what we owe to the projects and people we work with, and about how personal goals intersect with collaborative endeavors. The entertainment industry is built on ambition. Everyone wants to be a star, wants to be recognized, wants to achieve more than what they currently have. That's natural and not inherently problematic. But there's a difference between healthy ambition that drives you to do better work and achieve new heights, and corrosive ambition that makes you perpetually dissatisfied with where you are and unable to commit fully to what you're doing in the present moment. Weaver's situation exemplifies this tension. He was talented enough to want more, to believe he was capable of leading roles and starring vehicles. But his inability to be present and committed while he was still part of Gunsmoke created problems that extended far beyond his own career trajectory. Contrast this with Milburn Stone, who played Doc Adams for the entire 20-year run of the show. Stone never became a major movie star, never got leading roles in prestigious films. But he was beloved by audiences, respected by his peers, and he found deep satisfaction in the work he was doing on Gunsmoke. He understood that being part of a successful, meaningful television show was itself an achievement, that the opportunity to play a character for 2 decades and explore all the depths and nuances of that character was a gift that many actors never receive. Stone died in 1980, just 5 years after Gunsmoke ended, but he died knowing that he had been part of something special, that his work had mattered and would be remembered. Can the same be said for every actor who chased bigger opportunities only to find that success is often more elusive and less satisfying than they imagined? Let's also consider the impact all of this had on James Arness himself. Playing Matt Dillon for 20 years, being the leader of a major television production for that long, dealing with all the personalities and politics and pressures that come with that role, took a toll. Arness was not a man who sought attention or enjoyed conflict. He wanted to do good work, tell good stories, and be left alone to live his life. But the situation with Weaver, and to a lesser extent with Curtis and others over the years, forced him into a role he didn't want, that of enforcer and decision-maker on personnel issues. He had to have difficult conversations with producers, had to make his displeasure known when people weren't holding up their end of the bargain, had to sometimes put his foot down in ways that probably didn't come naturally to him. This created stress and tension that he carried with him, that affected his enjoyment of the work and his relationships with others. There are stories from later in the show's run about Arness becoming more withdrawn, more isolated from the rest of the cast and crew. Some of this was just the natural evolution of a long-running show, where the initial excitement and energy inevitably fades and people settle into routines. But some of it was also self-protection, a way of creating boundaries so that he didn't have to deal with the kind of interpersonal drama that had marked earlier years. By the time Gunsmoke finally ended in 1975, Arness was ready to be done with it, not because he didn't love the show or the character, but because he was exhausted by the accumulated weight of all those years, all those relationships, all those compromises and conflicts. He did return to play Matt Dillon in several made-for-TV movies in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which suggests that his love for the character never really died. But those were different, contained projects where he could work with hand-picked collaborators and didn't have to manage the complex ecosystem of a weekly series. So what are we to make of all this? What's the lesson here, if there is one? Perhaps it's simply that even the most successful, most beloved productions are made by human beings with all their flaws and complications. The magic we see on screen, the chemistry between characters that seems so effortless and natural, often conceals tensions and conflicts that would surprise us if we knew the full story. James Arness hating, or at least intensely disliking, Dennis Weaver doesn't diminish what they created together during those 9 years. The episodes they made, the characters they brought to life, the stories they told, all of that still has value and meaning independent of whatever personal issues existed between them. But it does remind us that art is hard, that collaboration is challenging, and that sustaining excellence over a long period requires not just talent but patience, commitment, and a willingness to put the collective good ahead of personal agendas. It's also worth noting that both Arness and Weaver, in their own ways, were products of their time and circumstances. Arness, shaped by his war experiences and his long apprenticeship in Hollywood before finding success, valued loyalty and commitment above almost everything else. Weaver, part of a younger generation of actors who were more willing to challenge traditional hierarchies and assert their own creative visions, saw nothing wrong with pursuing his ambitions even at the cost of some relationships. Neither approach is entirely right or entirely wrong. They're just different, reflecting different values and different ways of navigating a career in a notoriously difficult industry. The tragedy, if there is one, is that these differences created a rift that never fully healed, that two talented men who should have been able to look back on their collaboration with unalloyed pride instead carried some bitterness and regret. In the end, Gunsmoke stands as one of television's greatest achievements, a show that entertained audiences for 2 decades and created characters that became part of American cultural mythology. James Arness's Matt Dillon is right up there with the most iconic characters in television history, a testament to his talent, his dedication, and his understanding of what the role required. The fact that the journey to create all of that wasn't always smooth, that there were conflicts and tensions and relationships that fractured along the way, doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. Knowing what we now know about the difficulties behind the scenes, about the feuds and the frustrations and the sheer effort required to keep everything going year after year, we can appreciate even more just how special Gunsmoke was and how much was sacrificed to make it possible. And perhaps that's the most important thing to remember about James Arness and his complicated relationships with his co-stars, particularly Dennis Weaver. He kept going, kept showing up, kept delivering performances of integrity and depth even when the circumstances were difficult and the personal relationships were strained. That's professionalism of the highest order, and it's a big part of why Gunsmoke succeeded where so many other shows failed. Whatever Arness felt personally about Weaver or Curtis or anyone else, he never let it compromise the work. He never used it as an excuse to give less than his best. And that's ultimately what separated him from so many others, what made him not just a star but a true leader, someone who understood that sometimes you have to set aside your own feelings and preferences for the sake of something larger than yourself. That's the real story behind James Arness and the co-star he hated, a story not of pettiness or ego but of a man trying to maintain excellence and integrity in the face of very human conflicts and disappointments.